Okay, well, look, we've got some people arriving, and I've no doubt some people are quickly squirreling away their supper. And so what I would like to do is to welcome you to this, one of the coaches sessions, and thank you for attending. And I hope that you are maximising the opportunity to learn from some great inspirational speakers. And speaking of inspirational speakers, this evening we're joined again this year by Richard Cheetham MBE. And we're going to have an exploration conversation around planning for performance and, as it's aptly titled there, a new vision. And so Richard is a senior fellow professor at Winchester University, coach developer, and a very, very good friend of mine. And so without further ado, what I would like to do is to hand over to Richard. And what I would like to say to everybody else is, please, if you have any questions that come to mind as we go through this presentation, please put them in the chat box, and I will act as the moderator and engage with Richard on your behalf. So without further ado, over to you, Richard, my friend.
Thank you very much, Dusty, and welcome everybody to this tonight's session. Thanks very much for attending. And as Dusty says, it's very much an opportunity for me not just to share my ideas, but also to offer that platform for you to ask questions that are, really pertinent to your setting, and that's a critical part. That the context with which you operate in is crucial for making sure this discussion tonight works around that. So, when I was invited to present tonight, and I spoke to Dusty about how we would look at the session, I wanted to have a new vision because I wanted to bring in some of my experiences from other sports and coach development, and certainly around planning with a very structured, formal, but all this is more looking at more holistic approach to planning. So we look at the direction of travel tonight. One of the things that I found, I've started doing some work with some of the coaches with Dusty on the performance program, which I found really interesting. The first part is the benefit of planning with and for the athlete. The reason I wanted to make this the most important and the first starting point is I'm a lecturer as well as a coach, and one of the things that we had in the seminar today was about co-creation, the ability to put together a plan not just for those you teach or coach, but those with you teach and coach, because every setting is different, everyone's background is different, everyone's obstacles or hurdles, lifestyles and aspirations are different, and the important thing was not to do a one-size-fits-all approach. So it's very much engaging with the dialogue, understanding those that we coach in front of us, not just on the performance field, but just the additional side, the holistic side of it. The second one, which was again really important, where the ongoing reflective practice, the ability to fine-tune, change, or maintain what's been done. The worst thing would be to get to the end of a year and think, if only. So the constant reflection with those you coach and reflection with your coach mentor, with other coaches, is to making sure that we are headed to the right direction, that we need to adapt as see fit and modify that approach. And the last one, I'm just going to give you an example of some of the work I've done with one of the coaches in British fencing, which is being receptive to new ideas. And the reason I put that as the last one is that I believe that when we plan, if we just repeat the previous structure or the previous approach, are we allowing for innovation and change? And I brought one thing into a session with a coach, which I found hugely beneficial, not just myself, but the coach and athlete, and I'll talk about that at the end. So that's tonight's direction of travel. Those are our reference points. And again, it was through thought and discussion that I felt these were the three pillars of what we were going to do this evening. So if we look at a traditional planning model, which you'll be aware of in terms of our periodization, our year plan, our micro and macro cycles, this is a model that many athletes and teams and coaches will follow. Preparation, transition as we move from the preparation to more, as you can see, technique training. We drop volume and work on those more technical aspects, but the intensity and quality rises as we move towards the competition period. And the last period of UC is where we not only just rest, but we also reflect and look back on performance outcomes, initial goals, and any changes that we undertook during that period and the difference they've made. Now, I wanted to not ignore this model. That's critical to performance planning, a very structured approach. But I wanted to look at some of the more fringe areas that maybe not be explored. And so I started off with the first goal tonight, which is the benefit of planning with and for the athlete. So understand the individual, the co-creation of partnership, and construct the learning journey. I've done a session today with some colleagues at university about understanding the individual, and we looked at what I brought into the conversation about diversity. Now, diversity, I think, springs to mind gender, disability, ethnicity. And for me, in an educational and a coaching setting, that diversity is understanding the background of those in front of us. The background it could be those, but it's also maybe about educational background, prior experience, prior learning experiences, what the individual benefits from in terms of how we present the information. The session I talked on today was about transitioning from education to university, and that there was a belief that in one of the findings said that 15 years of education in a particular way then comes to university and it changes completely. So understanding the individual is when those come to us from different coaching settings, we really need to understand what their prior experience is. What was the successful aspects of learning? What could change? How they learn? And in this co-creation, not being frightened of asking the question of how do you want to learn? And knitting that into the planning. I think that the most effective engagement has certainly over the last 2 or 3 years with opening that question is understanding how our athletes are going to flourish. And flourishing comes from the setting, the environment, and understanding that some athletes want a certain type of approach and others want a different type of approach. And we really need to recognize a diversity, open up ourselves to saying how best can we learn, not losing our coaching role, not disempowering us, but actually opening dialogue to saying, what have you found that really benefits you, and how can we create sessions that allow you to get the best out of you? So those are the two things. And then what we then do is put together a learning journey. A learning journey is, as it says, how will we learn? What do we need to learn? How will we reflect upon that learning? And how best is that learning journey constructed, and also being open to change? So those are the three things. And I'll leave that to coaches in terms of how you approach the understanding of the individual. But it's been very sensitive to that the word it says the individual. Do I know the person well enough to know that this is how I can optimize my coaching? Don't be dissuaded by the middle bit where it says co-creation and partnership, because sometimes I can be nervous to say, well, what do you think, or what would be your opinion? It doesn't mean that we are giving them complete ownership on that learning journey or that planning. It means that they are a part of it. And if they're a part of it, they're invested in it. And if they co-create it, they're invested in that. They have a role to play in its shape. And that's much more healthy, much more positive. And rather than leave those sort of open-ended themes, I've given this pathway, if you like, from top left to bottom right, which I found hugely beneficial to when I coach. I coach an amateur rugby team throughout the season. I'm as sensitive to these questions as I am to if I coach my students or coach individuals or work with coaches. So this deeper sense of understanding, for me, is the starting point. The plan that you saw about the microcycles and preparation for competition, it is obviously essential. It is our guide. But before I start that journey, how can I start it without really knowing who's in front of me? And so the top part is what's important to this person right now. And I can't answer that. I can't make an assumption of that. But if the goal is one of success at the highest level, if one is participation, if one is enjoyment, then that will direct the intensity of my approach to them, the commitment that would be needed. And I can turn the dial up or down based upon what's important. But that importance is not just the sport. There's lots of things going on in that person's life. It could be a student who is currently doing their degree, their A-levels, who's going through a transition into employment, a geographical move from an area, and wants some grounding and understanding of, I need to settle into this area. And so we need to be open to the answers that they give us. And then as we move on to the second part, I mentioned the word about commitments and what's happening in their life that can influence my approach. Again, I'll give an example of the team I coach. That could be new arrivals, new family members, new marriages, moving to the area. How will that shape my approach? And it allows me just to check in, to step back and understand that the changes in the life of the person I'm coaching directly affects my ability to work with them, not negatively, but really understand, okay, now I understand, and that means I can change my approach. Okay, in the bottom left, how can I understand the impact of their life experiences? Well, the shaping that someone will have when they come to us will have already made vast differences in terms of how they act. Now, when you have a new athlete, you will adopt an athlete who has been coached a certain way, who've had different approaches to their life educationally. And then if you're different, then you need to understand that sometimes that can be an adjustment. So, for example, when I coach, the ability for athletes to feel free to contribute is not always common. And I say, well, what do you think? How can we? And they will have never been asked that question. Their previous life experiences have prevented them feeling free thinking to be able to contribute to the program we put together. When you have all of those three things together, you are now best placed to plan. And ultimately, we want to optimize performance. This is even before we've got into any performance setting. Really important grounding. I don't want to use this phrase too much in my teaching, but connection before content. I know that some coaching is going to follow, but I've got to connect with you on a deeper level than purely the sport. And so this is how I start. This is, when we use the word organic, what I want to try and describe with that word is that the organic is naturally evolving. The authenticity of your approach with your athletes is really important. It's not a question of when's your birthday, how many children have you got. These questions just evolve. They sometimes present themselves. There'll be cues that you want to follow. And when you have this insight, it's not anything, it's not intrusive. It's a general interest in that person's well-being. I had some work within professional cycling where the sport directors who were very open to this, but one said to me, well, I find this quite intrusive. I said, and I was very certain and sure of my footing, because I said, well, it's only intrusive if the questions you ask are not appropriate, not timely, and ones that you feel are forced. We can ask these questions through conversation and dialogue.
Okay, sorry, Rich,
yes.
Just before you move on there,
Yeah.
Do you have an expectation or an encouragement of the athlete's responsibility towards your approach here? Is it something you're going to cover later, or is it the right time to ask that question?
Yeah, it is the right time to ask that question. It's a really pertinent question, because I think whilst we're asking these questions, we always, we've coached together a long time, and it's the why.
Yeah.
So it's not them asking the why always. Well, why are you asking me these questions? It's the intuition, and I've used the phrase in my coaching. And it sounds quite, I don't know, spiritual maybe, but it's a way of being.
Yeah.
It's, in other words, that way of being means that there is a comfort in that person who understands that this is about nurturing them. This is about understanding through conversation. This is not a set of interview questions.
Yeah.
And what very often happens is that something in that insight you have from that athlete will emerge later that will enable you to understand.
Yeah, and I guess right to try to canter on a little bit in my thinking is what if any is the responsibility of the coach to role model the behaviours that they want to see in the athlete with regards to sharing, gaining insight and understanding of each other in the relationship.
Yeah, listen, if someone is going to be open and volunteer that information, then it can, it's something that we need to hold, remember. And I use this in a coaching, which is retention and retrieval. I'll hold that information, and when it's appropriate, it will come and I'll understand why.
Yeah.
And it can be anything from turning up late for training sessions to understand that maybe that the coaching is not the priority in their life, but it also may be the priority. And understanding that, intuition and experience go hand in hand with, when you talk about role modeling, what it means is that we need to ensure that we are really listening, deep listening, and taking that on board. Okay. It's not the introduction. It's actually sometimes the main theme throughout.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that. And what I would do is reach out to those that are on the call and the webinar. Please do, if you have a question that emerges for you and occurs for you, please do drop it in the chat, and I'll do my best to get your questions in. Okay. Thanks, Cheetham.
That's okay. I mean, I'll say this to the coaches online now. I listen to podcasts quite a lot just to get some gems from there, and I listened to Diary of a CEO, and they had a speaker on there who was talking about, and he helps people be better at public speaking. He also helps people to be better at listening, but he sells his workshops for public speaking 5 times more than he does for those about who want to be better at listening. And it is a surprise, but not a surprise. We want to be better at talking, but how can we get better at really listening? And deep listening means that sometimes behind something that someone's telling you, they may be telling you something else. And when you want, you talk about role modeling and settings, environments, we know when we're heard. Yeah. People like to talk. People like to share. The intensity which we expect our athletes to commit to in terms of the training and physical and mental challenges can only really be engaged and expected if we actually listen to the first part of it as well.
Yeah, and that makes me think of some of the excellent work done by Dr. Jonathan Katz, who is well known in the fencing space, but also across other sports. Is he will often talk to the power of listening and listening to understand, etc. And we will certainly be continuing to deep dive later on throughout this season to look at the power of listening. So thank you for that, and that's a good nudge as well.
No, I mean, I remember when my daughter was 2 years old and I was muddling my way through parenthood, and a friend of mine said, and they were going through the terrible twos and crying, and a friend of mine just said, they're just trying to tell you something.
Something,
yeah.
And your job is to try and work it out, yeah.
Yeah, and that I don't have to do a very good job at it sometimes, but that telling you something comes across not just in the verbal things, but also in their behaviours. And those, is being able to pick up on that. So, and I'll share with you at the end of it something I found really significant in my work with British fencing, which for me was, I don't know, those moments, champagne moment called it in cricket, where I sat there and went, okay, wow, now we all understand.
Now we're all hanging, waiting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we want the next chapter.
Come on, breadcrumbing.
So maybe that's the end of that's the tease to keep people hooked until the end. But something I'm happy to discuss and share, because hugely beneficial again in that planning, because the planning is not a year's cycle. The planning is in the moment, that hour, that warm up, that session. And sometimes I think when we think about planning is, well, this time next year. Well, actually, what about this next hour? This next 15 minutes? So that's really, when I put the new vision, I think it was to try and, if you said I'm going to plan, I think people think about calendars rather than hours, and both have a place.
Yeah.
So this is an approach called appreciative inquiry. I brought this in from my work with physiotherapists, who will have someone who's obviously injured, in poor health, and it's about the dream realities. So it's taken them from where I am now to where I want to be. So it's that journey which we'll hear that word a lot. But appreciative inquiry goes through 4 phases, and it's the phrase we may have heard is meeting them where they're at. So we are here now. I don't have any over expectations or misunderstandings of exactly where we are and where it is we want to go. And through conversation, discussion, we can discover what it is they're aiming for, what the challenges are, their direction of travel. And it is very important. It's their goals, not our goals. That's appreciative inquiry. We listen to what their aspirations are going to be, but being mindful that we can encourage them to aim higher or be realistic, whichever it is, but understand that we need to know what it is they're moving towards. And that comes to discussion. The dream is where we literally talk about that finish line. How would you describe where it is you're going to go? I imagine that, I hope that, I aim to be. And when you talk about that dream, it becomes very much a feeling. They can picture what it's like. They can picture the destination. They can picture the event in some cases, the location of the event. And when we can make that a more realistic picture, then we've got that as our reference point. And again, with those 2 things in place, we then start to plan. And periodization, which is breaking it down into small sections, week, month, and then year, and sessions. And that planning then looks at measurable goals, reflections, and the destiny is where we end up. So it's about, in physio, it's about looking at the injury and how we're going to get back to full health. What does full health look like? What does being mobile, what does being near to performance look like? And we can apply that to our athletes as well. Okay, so one of the second of the 3 themes tonight. Actually, I'm just going to go back if it's okay, because I want to just see if there's any questions or thoughts. I've just sped through that first third. Apologies for that, without allowing people to ask any questions on those.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that's emerged in the chat box at the moment.
Okay. So if we move on to the next part of this planning, I put 4 stages down to this ongoing reflective practice in performance planning. So we pre-mortem, plan for what could go wrong. We are in action, reflecting, observing, analysing, adapting, and that constant cues that are coming back. So whilst it's written in terms of this is our plan, its ability to be able to move away from the plan, based upon the performance levels, interruptions, hurdles that come back to us. So it's when it talks about continue to analyze the flowing events, it's being fully mindful. There is not this linear start and finish point. We're going to lose days through injury. One of my friends is an athletics coach, and he said, I write off 6 weeks each year for injuries. And he doesn't literally write those 6 weeks off, but he says to himself, it is likely that I'm going to get at some point 6 weeks of injuries. And so that doesn't become a surprise. And then with that approach, what's really helped is that the athlete then doesn't get anxious because the coach has already taken into account these hurdles and bumps in the road that are going to come along. This analysing the flow of events means, as we've alluded to in the beginning, those events are performance events, life events, people doing exams, students doing studies, people changing jobs, families, whatever those flow events are, is thinking, how will this impact on the planning that we set? Can I work around it? And through discussion, can we somehow find a way to adapt accordingly? So the second part of that, search for cues which may have been present in previous experiences, again goes back to the last thing I mentioned. What are they telling you? What things are happening that indicating to you that the planning needs to change, is going well, or somewhere in between? So this could be things like fatigue. Are they training? Is the training load too much? Is it not enough? It could be levels of motivation that are not caused by the training or the competition, but could by other things that may distract them. And this is when the important foundations that we built at the beginning, where someone feels they can be open enough and talk with you, and not just talk but be heard, allows them for you to understand that what you expected would happen or what's coming. That means they're open enough to share that with you. And the third part down about reflection, development of an individual's perceptual capacities using intuition. So what I mean by this is, how intuitive are you to what's going on? How intuitive are they to what is happening in that performance setting as well? Are we seeing the same things? And intuition, as I said before, it's a way of being, it's a way of understanding. That constant flow of feedback and dialogue will allow you to notice things, underperformance, overperformance, fatigue, turning up late. It could be a whole variety of things, but understanding that those things are happening and you are engaging with them. And the last part of this reflective piece was recall and recognize events, similarity across contexts. So it's being able to look back and say, I always think one of the things about reflection as we move through it is, you as a coach are very often then a person who says to them, let me remind you where you were. And that's often forgotten. The struggle. I'm not working too much with this friend of mine who's on Britain's Strongest Man in a few weeks' time. I don't, just through conversations. What we do is, when we check in, we constantly remind himself of where he has been and where he is now. That's sometimes forgotten. And when you do that reflection, you think, blimey, I really have grown. I really have changed. I really have made gains. I really have showed commitment. And that's really important as a good motivational lift, because we sometimes, as an athlete, can forget the progress we've made. I mean, even at university here, I often speak to my third years and they look back on their first year work and go, blimey, I can't believe I did that in the first year. And I said, well, that's part of growth, that's change. That's what you're here for, is not to finish a degree in the first year. It's to finish a degree right now, doing what you're doing at this level, because those 2 years have been growth each year. Really important, because actually that is a good check-in, it's a good understanding, and it's greater awareness.
And I think thinking about that, Rich, What does that mean practically for our coaches?
So I think when we start off with this realistic goal setting is exactly that. Confidence is expectation over outcome. And if we have people say, I've lost confidence, well, because the goals are too high. You expected too much. I expected too much of you. And the idea of our confidence is the stretch that we can reach realistically. It's your goal, nobody else's. This is the critical part of it. Is not to look left and right at what others are doing, but to look at yourself and that individualized learning journey that says, let's remind ourselves what we promised at the beginning. Let's check in on that.
Yeah.
And again, just going back to, I will talk about it now if it's okay with you, Dusty, about the dialogue I had with listened to with the fencer and the coach. There were 6 comments on a review by the athlete. 5 were negative. 5 were negative about themselves. 1 was positive. Now, I don't necessarily think that's the individual as a person. I think that's how we are when we reflect. We sometimes forget where we were. We look in the moment of what's happened, and we forget actually, well, look, this is halfway through a phase. 6 months ago, we weren't even here at this stage. Yes, it's good to reflect and be critical, but let's also be realistic. And this recall is reminding somebody exactly what we have started to build. And planning and building go together, creating and change go together. Confidence comes with realistic expectations, not saying by the end of this year I'm going to be. It's saying, well, it's not that you want to be at some point, then maybe this is not a realistic time frame from which to achieve that.
Okay. Thank you.
But I know that those on the line tonight are not, but maybe you've got athletes you'll coach for a period of time. As I've got students, I teach and coach for 3 years, and team I coach for a season. There are a lot of things in there that are measures of success. And if you look at studies across sports and learning and skill acquisition, success is an individual measure. So I must measure myself by where I was and where I am now. I cannot measure myself against others.
Yeah. Okay.
And then one of the really important things as well. Now, Dusty, I asked you this just from not being totally familiar with fencing, setting and environment, although I think I have some understandings. Would you say that many of the fencing coaches work together, co-coach, or do many of them operate in isolation with an athlete on a one-to-one?
My experience has been the latter. Tends to be in one-to-one scenarios. However, and the however is those coaches that are being that are giving up their time to come and work inside the athlete development pathway. We're spending a significant amount of time through coach developers such as yourself in exploring the notion of co-coaching and the benefits of sharing learning, athlete to athlete, coach to coach, athlete to coach, and coach to athlete, and some of the leadership that the likes of Jonathan Katz, Ian Litchfield, Fran Whaley, and Ben Peggs now, but prior to that, Chris Gallasloot, they were showing good leadership in those spaces around actually how do we share learning and work together in order to achieve our performance goals.
Yeah.
So, but I would say that generally speaking, it's a one-person band, jack of all, master of some, and jack of others. So, yeah, that's my experience, and none of that is meant as a criticism at all. Of course, it isn't. It's the state of play. We're on a journey.
Yeah, and I think I know why I asked that question, because right at the beginning when I said about this new vision of planning for performance,
Mm-hmm.
we need to be athlete centered, absolutely, with their journey. But when I mean about coach centered, we're planning for them, but are we planning for ourselves?
Mm.
And I haven't worked in equestrian. I've worked with some equestrian coaches, and I was, fascinated that I think it's about 70-75% of them operate in isolation.
Yeah.
Private equestrian coaches, and they are their own reflector.
Mm.
So that journey back is very much the conversation with themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm thinking about planning for performance, one of the critical things, as you know, I remember a long time when somebody said to me, well, who coaches you? I went, I don't know. And they said, well, you need to. And it was only other than the reassurance of checking in that I had some almost in wellbeing counselling, you call it supervision, which is where you can go to somebody who is experienced and just say, this is what I've done. What do you think? Can you come watch me? Can you support me? And when I put these questions here, this is the piece for the coaches online tonight to actually think about themselves, ultimately to benefit the athletes in front of us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's certainly an exploration space that we're currently having, supported by the likes of yourself. And again, I'll name drop Jonathan Katz again. He is doing some significant work now with coaches and coaches working together, which is really benefiting our athletes. We're beginning to see shared vulnerabilities in learning. That's my sense, and it's really powerful. It is really powerful, and some of the work that's being done by all of you supporting fencing is very much appreciated by the coaches, because it is breaking down some of those barriers. And your comments there do speak to the webinar that Dr. Jonathan's delivering for us this week, and will continue to deliver throughout the season around coach self-care, thriving, surviving, and how to look after themselves. So it's a really pertinent point.
Yeah, and I think we don't want the surviving bit to come into it, because we want the thriving bit to come into it. And I reach out to the coaches this evening, and please answer if you want to in the chat box. But I would say to them, it's an open question really. Is when you drive home from a session, if it's not gone so well, who do you ring? When it's gone really well, who do you share that with? How do you know? Are you the person who, like the athlete, would be 5 negative comments for every positive one? Because we don't reflect with perspective. We don't look at ourselves and go, you know what, that was brilliant. We're not comfortable with that. So when you're planning, what's really, I think it's important that we are reflecting upon our own performance. I'm not saying that coaches aren't doing that, but I think it's reflecting on our performance with others.
Yeah.
Is that the real story? Is that the true narrative? Or is our anxiety creating am I doing enough part of it? And when we ask that question, am I doing enough? We would need to say to ourselves the same question we'd ask the athlete is, how are you doing? And they would understand they're doing much better maybe than they give themselves credit for. And that's the same with coaches.
Yeah.
So the reason I put these questions down is, what part of my coaching was most impactful? And I recall last season's coaching when we played 22, lost 19, won 3, which is not necessarily something to give me, it gave me sleepless nights. But the most impactful part, when I put my hand on the heart and said, well, actually, the most impactful part is that we have got the same number of players at the beginning of the season at the end.
Yeah.
We've got a friendship and a unity that has come through resilience. And I looked generally and authentically. I didn't sugarcoat it, but the impact of creating a group of friends that wanted to play together was the voices they were telling me, rather than me seek something that wasn't there.
Sure.
So again, just look at what you mean by impact.
Yeah.
The second part is how you measure it. Not everything that measures, not everything you can measure counts. Not everything that counts measures. I think that's a very badly described phrase, but we look at measures that are maybe something from a young athlete has suddenly found this love of it, and they can't wait for more. The results are not of no consequence, but their aspirations, their commitment, their diligence, their turning up, their recovery from injury, their resilience at defeat. Those are really important measures. Really important. And so, again, going back to that first line, plan for performance and new vision, we must plan in there something for ourselves. And that can be that voice, that trusting person we can call informal or formal mentoring that allows us to check and challenge ourselves. And as you say, thrive, not survive. Okay, so the 3 points on there again, how does my coach experience implement coaching behaviors? We bring to our coaching the influence of others when we're athletes. We may have had some bad coaching thinking, you know what, I would never do that. And we've had some really enriching experiences that we perpetuate. And that can be a good and bad thing. But I think the important thing is, am I coaching the individual or am I bringing how I was coached to that individual? And two very different things. The fourth part in here is, where could I learn more? I always think that don't let the ceiling of the coach be the ceiling of the athlete. Are constantly staying ahead, constantly seeking out new ideas to bring to the sessions. And again, that's, thank you to the coaches tonight for your attendance and engagement in this learning program. Is that there's things tonight you'll pick up that will, allow you to develop yourselves, develop your athletes. And it's multiple ways of where we can learn. And the final, how I know the experience is an understanding of the participants. Again, this is right at the beginning, the questioning, the reflecting, and being, I don't like the word vulnerable, but ultimately we are going to have to ask our athletes, what was your experience? Can you give me some feedback? And not being frightened of that, because that is about getting to the end of that year's cycle and not saying, I wish you told me this halfway through. And again, that comes to the openness and dialogue at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that makes me think about, so vulnerability can be one of those trigger words, can't it? And some people will shy away from the sense or the feeling of vulnerability and see it as a negative, but actually we know through research, through lived experiences and experience that being comfortably uncomfortable in some situation, or being uncomfortable in some situations, is really impactful. And being able to have the confidence in your own ability to role model the vulnerabilities that you are feeling in that moment helps others share their experiences and their want and their yearning for learning, as it were.
Yeah, and I pick up on one of the things you just said then is about sharing our vulnerability. If I bring a new idea to my coaching, the first thing I say to those I'm coaching is I say this: look, this is a new idea. I'm trying it. Let me know what you think. Immediately, then it means that they're understanding that I'm open to feedback. They're not scared, and it allows them to give me that genuine feedback. Allows them to add to something.
Yeah,
and that's, we want our coaches to try new things, to look at innovation, to try new practices, new warm-ups, new equipment, whatever it is. But you also, again, the word vulnerability is one which means, I think, the word threat. If we're vulnerable, we're threatened by something. But I would use the word, have courage to try new things, and openness. The openness is being prepared for maybe things that we don't want to hear. Oh, I thought you really enjoyed that. No, that didn't work. Those ouch moments. But those are the ones which, without being cheesy in that, is where we grow. Yeah,
and sometimes it does feel awkward, doesn't it? I'm curious because in the chat box in the Q&A piece, there was a red light that came on. I clicked on it and there's nothing there. So I would ask, if somebody has just asked a question, please ask that question again in the chat box rather than the QA only piece. So drop it in the chat box and see if it drops in. I'm wondering whether we've actually got some questions that I'm not seeing, which makes me curious and uncomfortable and feeling a little bit vulnerable.
Yeah, well, I think it's the questions that we want to ask. It's the important ones. It's about being open and thinking, well, how we create an environment where people can tell that this, it's the question we never asked. I think is the one we want to avoid.
Absolutely.
Rather than one we would like to, but daren't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So this reflective piece here, again, going back to the slide about new vision, is allowing that. If we go, I'm going to go right back here. Sorry.
Keep going, because I've only got importance of ongoing reflective practice at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop right at the. Got performance planning.
Yeah, got performance planning.
Okay, so that's on the screen.
Yeah.
So my postgraduate degree was in sports science, and this was all very, very sort of. This was the start and finish, the planning, the structure, and the scientific, the measures, and so on and so forth. But
yeah,
I think what I'd like to do in maybe develop this is how do we performance plan for ourselves?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How do we do things that actually take away? What does preparatory period mean for the coach?
Yeah.
Okay. What does the transition period mean for the coach? What does the competition period mean for the coach? So that's, again, speaking to one of your coaches, Dusty, when they said, well, I've got an athlete who's great in training, but the pressure of competition is too much. And I said, well, why don't we change the word competition to opportunity? There's an opportunity for you to compete against people of a higher level, an opportunity for learn. And just softening that language takes away that pressure. So I'm not saying that we don't lessen the importance of competition, but we reframe it. And at the end of the transition period, active rest, well, I'd again ask the coaches online tonight, what word would we change there at the end of it? I would say, I'm answering my question now, which is not a good coaching approach. But if this is my academic year or my rugby season, my active rest would be literally rest, switch off, reflect formally, with our coach mentor with athletes, formally, people who have shared similar experiences. And, I would very much do things in that period where the enjoyment from learning is something, well, I'm going to read what I want to read and look what I want to look at and come back refreshed for the next phase. So maybe my job now, Dusty, next time we meet or extend it on to you is performance planning for a coach that takes away those themes at the bottom, but orientates around the coach.
Yeah, it's a good punt for extra work, Richard. Well done.
Well, you're welcome. I'll see you the same time next week.
The gift that keeps on giving.
That's right, yeah. Always an opportunity. I've just mentioned that, you see. So.
No, absolutely. And it's always good to learn from you, my friend.
Okay, so I'm learning about technology and different platforms tonight.
Yeah.
Okay, so the model of Dreyfus is a model of skill acquisition. Okay, why did I include this slide and what's the importance of it? So again, in that planning, I'm sure that the coaches, when they first started, as I did when I started, it was very structured, followed the guidelines, but we know as we become more experienced and become more competent, more proficient, that we can become more intuitive of what planning looks like. And I would just say the bottom phrase, and if you can look at the last box on the bottom of the graph, bottom right, it says just do what works. Okay, in a way, I like that. It doesn't mean it's not a flippant comment, but just remember that what I said at the beginning. It's like, it's a way of being. Well, that this works. This is, I understand the structure and I'm planning. I'm not loose or irresponsible in it, but this planning structure is really built on intuition and understanding of the individual, of the sport, and of the reflective of the experience that I have had.
So to be clear, then, what we are looking at here is we say that this is the expert athlete being supported by an expert coach. Yeah. So we're looking. So planning doesn't necessarily go out of the window per se, but what we are doing is understanding that the relationship between, and I'll use two names that you may or may not be familiar with, Richard, but the fencing community will be familiar with. The relationship between Zemek and Richard Cruz at the height of his performance as the world number one is likely to be expert coach, expert athlete, and therefore the responsibility for performance extend to others in the environment around them, which may lead to no analysis or planning. Pattern recognition extends to plan as well as action. And so the notion of just do what works becomes intuitive. Is that a
100%?
Without actually knowing,
yeah.
But you don't necessarily know Zemek, who you may have come across him in your travels. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example of a guy called Dan Martin, who's an ex-professional cyclist.
Sure.
Just read his autobiography. Very successful cyclist. Went through about, I think it was 6 or 7 professional teams. He was at his best when somebody said to him, how can we get the best out of you? And that's how we'll plan. And his training was very different from other members of the team. And cycling teams historically, not saying now, we're very much like, we all do this, we all do this, we all do this.
Yeah.
And the first coach said to him, well, what works for you? So we'll like to do this in December. In January, like to that, like to do this race, don't like that race, like this. I said, right, okay, that's your plan for the year then. And that was the success. Okay. And when you talk about pattern recognition, it's really important, that cause and effect. Recognizing that we engage, we perform, we enjoy, we thrive in this setting. So that's interesting when you mentioned about that. But I think that we won't have tonight, a whole group of expert coaches. We'll have coaches with expertise. With less high performing athletes. But it doesn't mean that we're not listening.
No.
It just means that we again evolve, look at the patterns of the individual, fine tune in our planning. We set a plan down, and we know that every plan doesn't survive first contact, as we spoke earlier. But it's understanding that we've got to be agile.
Yeah.
So the last part of the session is really a reflection on, again, the invitation to come and work beach fencing, which I don't have a background in it, but I have a background in creative thinking and creativity, and being vulnerable about things that do and don't work, but being prepared to try things. And the innovation comes from having an imagination, and I wouldn't say imagination, kind of thinking about something too out of the box, but it's about imagine if I had an idea, imagine if we thought of something different, imagine if we changed something, what would you imagine that would be? Well, that we need to use our imagination. We need to look at other sports, that divergent thinking. And that's the beauty, I suppose, I've had of working with different sports, is that I am able to see how boxers spend so much time on foot care and footwork, and cyclists spend so much time on dealing with athletes, managing the time away from home, 200 days a year away from your family. So there's a lot more of creating a family to family.
Yeah.
And learning these different ideas, how different sports operate. The impact of that, So creativity is only as good as the difference that your ideas make. It's not creativity for creativity's sake. Sorry, I'm not sure if that was me or you.
No, that was me. I was just seeing because I can see. I know there is a different slide, but I can't see it. So
Okay.
apologies for that, mate. Go on, keep going.
You jumped to the end of the film before you know how it ends now. And exploration. Well, in our planning, are we so fixed and so set in our ways that we don't actually need time to? Well, let's try something new. Do we factor that in our planning, or are we regurgitating and recycling things we've done before? That doesn't mean they're not being successful, but how do we grow? We grow by, as you mentioned before, being outside the comfort zone, trying new things, lateral thinking or divergent thinking. And so the last slide from tonight is the fencing coach I work with. And I just said, well, I come from my daughter's mountain biking and from my limited mountain biking, because I'm not as fearless as she is that how can I see what they're seeing? If I can see through the eyes of the athlete, will it give me a greater understanding of what exactly is going on? And equally, the same for the coach. Can I reflect upon that? Not just sit and have a discussion, but actually have something tangible to look at and reflect upon, to talk about. So the athlete and the coach wore a GoPro on their mask. And we've done 2 sessions now. The first session was fascinating because I didn't know what's going to happen. I had no idea how successful it's going to be. But it was at a phase of the training where we said, well, look, why don't we just try it? Other sports try it. Let's just have a go. It didn't impede. The important thing is it didn't impede their performance and didn't impede their coaching. It didn't ask them to do anything that took extra time. It was post-session, and then the second time we did it, we broke it down into blocks of 5 minutes and skills. So the first time we took the athlete and the coach, put the video on, sat down, and 2 things emerged. One phrase, now I know what you mean by that. And the second one was, I didn't realize I was doing that. Now, those 2 statements that came from what ended up just being a sort of 20-minute post training session reflection. If that's all we'd got from that video, that was something that didn't exist beforehand. A dialogue that opened up, an awareness that opened up, the coach being aware of, maybe I could have. And then what happened was the reflection on the self-deprecating conversation of the athlete that I just picked up on. I said, well, you've made 6 comments, 5 are negative. And although these aren't tangible scores, physical performance in terms of quicker, better, we are deepening our understanding. The coach is deepening his understanding. Now the coach and athlete both have their own videos of one another. So the athlete can look at themselves fighting, and the athlete can also look at the coach coaching. And what we found when we, I'm just going to close the window a second.
That's that coach coming to see you.
Yeah, it's unusual having a student on campus this late, unless the bar's open. So,
that's it now. On the way to the bar.
Yeah, well, I'll just hurry this up and get down there with them.
Of course you will.
And it was fascinating, and I hope I can share this with you, Dusty. I hope when we reach the pilot project that we can share this, because it is in line. Yeah. And that's not me having an agenda. It was literally, I'm not a fencer, I'm not a fencing coach, but I'm aware of learning and coaching. And to sit there in that sort of 15 minutes coffee post-training session, and the chat that was between coach and athlete, there was nothing like the chat that was the previous sessions I sat in on. And, if the work I'd done opened up this awareness, discussion, dialogue, ultimately performance enhancement, there's reflection for you right there. Reflection of, oh yeah, maybe I could have done, or I'm glad I did, or thank you for that, I see what you mean now. This is really organic, authentic reflection on performance that comes through dialogue. And it was one of the things that I'm most delighted with when I've worked with the coaches, Dusty.
Yeah, and I certainly have, as you know, I've engaged with this, and I have had the honour of looking at this footage, these films, and I've also had the opportunity to have an informal conversation with the coach. I haven't spoken to the athlete, but from the coach. And what I do know is this is the first time that coach has seen themselves coach from an athlete's point of view, as you can see in this still here. What this doesn't really bring to life, unfortunately, is the actual dialogue as it's being received by the athlete coming from the coach, and the coach being able to hear that. And so it's really powerful. And your innovation to put a GoPro with a microphone so that it captures the audible and the visual viewpoint of an athlete is really powerful. And so I know from my conversations with the coach that it has had a significant impact on their coaching, their understanding of their own coaching process, because they've now seen themselves and heard themselves coach from an athlete's point of view, which is a very privileged position. You don't hear it very often. Often when you get supported by coach developers, you can hear yourself coach, but it's always from a third position on a video, on analysis, just like when we have analysis of a field of play or analysis of an athlete going up and down the piste. But in this instance, what you're getting is exactly that. It is the athlete's view of the receiving of the practical coaching. And I actually think it is probably going to be world leading from a British fencing perspective if we get this right.
I mean, that's great to know. I mean, look, I'm not going to quantify this number, but if we want to get to 100% and we're at 50, well, it's easy to get to 60. You can make some changes. But if we're operating at 85, 86%, those extra 1% don't come from massive, significant shifts because we're at that very high performance level. They come from a small edge, the extra edge, the small difference. And that's what these opportunities are provided for. It's I mean, I had seriously thought about transcribing the dialogue between them, giving to them, and then saying, highlighting interactions, positive, negatives, descriptions, repeated phrases, cue words. And that's
and actual without, again, as you know, and everybody listening will know, that I'm not a fencing coach either. However, we know and understand that the way that the coach presents the blade, it's the indicator for the athlete to respond. And so it would be a really useful tool for the coach to develop themselves as well. So whilst we're on the subject of performance and performance planning and planning for performance, here is how we're innovating in this space as an opportunity to grow and explore that plan as well from a coach development perspective. So I think this is an impactful opportunity, or has the potential to be.
Yeah, and again, I'm really glad that it's made that difference. We're not finished with it yet. We're going to revisit this. But I go right back to the beginning of those understanding our athletes. And one of the things I've done with coaching children workshops is something, as you know, called language empathy. And language empathy is a language the coach is using, reflective of the understanding of the level of knowledge and vocabulary of the athlete. So we don't coach a language that alienates them. We use words that they are empathetic to their understanding. We're not too technical. We're not too complex. We keep things simple because we empathize with the learner. And that's what comes across is what do you mean by that? Or I understand. That's where you need to get to. This word means this action, that cue. So I'm glad that I was able to bring some innovation into the session tonight, because I wanted to really sort of not validate, but just show the impact which we spoke about at the beginning, the difference that we've made. And like I watch this space and where we're going to be.
Yeah. And so for those that are watching and listening, And what you may not be able to make out from the picture, because it might be small on your screen, is actually a GoPro masking taped to the chin area of the mask of the coach. And it was very similar for the athlete too. If you could fast forward and think about how tech is these days, and think about how in Formula One you get a driver's view from the cockpit of the F1 car, it's not beyond the wit of man or woman to think that actually in the Leon Paul Centre, they may be able to embed this type of lens, a fisheye lens, and mic into a coaching mask, so on and so forth. So, you know, we're on the I think we're on the cusp of being leading edge globally for coach development.
I mean, I think there's never, you know, this is how things start. You know, I look back on that first moment, you know, gaffer tape. There just happened to be some gaffer tape with Leon Paul. We gaffer taped it on there. We realised that the head height had to be similar. We couldn't have the top coach looking at the top of the athlete and the athlete looking at, so we modified that. And those things are innovation, piloting and learning and starting there. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, so we've explored that, and thank you for exploring planning from a coach's perspective and the importance of planning and planning for performance. Just a final plea to everybody out there is, if you have got a question, please do ask, or if you've got my phone number, drop me a text. if we're not getting anything through on the chat box, because it is quiet. But any final thoughts and observations from yourself, Rich?
Thank you to the coaches for coming tonight. You know, I hope there's some takeaways from that. A bit like the GoPro, you know, I think it was my third or fourth visit there, wasn't it? And I was talking about a lot of things, and it was walking away with one thing. You know, every investment in that journey up to London was worth it for the one thing I brought back. And that's the thing about learning, is you're never going to come with 10 or 20 things. You just need to come with one or two things you hadn't thought of, things you want to try, conversations that you're now going to start. And my email address is there if anybody does want to contact me. But again, I think we've got an open dialogue now, Dusty, about the very last slide that we
Absolutely.
showed.
Yeah, open dialogue, please, and do just hit myself up, and we can have a conversation about that. And you will notice that in the chat box we've dropped the feedback form as well, please. So if you could do that, that would be helpful, because that helps us learn around the benefits of Learning Week to you individually and those that attended. And even if you watch this on playback, also complete the feedback form as well. And so without further ado, thank you, Richard, and thank you everybody for attending. And I look forward to working with you in the future and seeing you all out there on the circuit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.